I've had to redo this script about 3 times now. We love perfectionism. Good evening, my lovely ghouls and curious mortal minds. You've seen the title, but don't worry. I'll give you exactly what you came for. But first, a little disclaimer. I'm not a certified historian, nor do I have an academic degree in art history. My knowledge comes from research that I've done throughout the ever-mysterious web that we call the internet. I'm simply here to share stories of artists who have made a powerful mark on our earth that aren't just the same tales of Vincent van Gogh or Michelangelo. The brilliance of these artists deserve better, and tonight we're shining a light back on them. These are the artists who have shaped culture while living in bodies, identities, and geographies the art world wasn't ready to accept. Also, if an artist I talk about catches your interest, feel free to leave a comment or slither off to your own research. You might be surprised by what you uncover. Now then, let's explore the overlooked, the extraordinary, and the artists that everyone should know. First, allow me to introduce you to Laura Aguilar, a photographer who challenged the gilded traditions of art and demanded space for bodies and identities so often dismissed or erased. Born in 1959 in San Gabriel, California, Aguilar grew up on the crossroads of culture. Her father, a first-generation Mexican-American, and her mother, of mixed Mexican and Irish heritage. She also lived with auditory dyslexia, a condition that made traditional learning a challenge and influenced her unique, unconventional voice as an artist. Her fascination with photography began early, inspired by her brother's darkroom work. She studied at East Los Angeles College and attended workshops, but much of her craft was self-taught. That independence gave her art its unmistakable character, intimate, unfiltered, and profoundly human. Aguilar's work gravitated towards those who rarely saw themselves in art: LGBTQ communities, Chicanas, the working class, plus size, and disabled bodies. Long before the word intersectionality became fashionable, Aguilar was already embodying it, weaving identities together in her lens and challenging society's rigid definitions of beauty and belonging. Her most striking subject was often herself, nude, vulnerable, yet powerful. In a world quick to marginalize fat, disabled, brown, or queer bodies, Aguilar stood bare and unapologetic, claiming space that art history has too often denied. One of her defining achievements was the Plush Pony series in 1992, set inside an East Los Angeles Latina lesbian bar. Aguilar built a portable studio within that space and captured portraits of patrons, gender non-conforming individuals, butch/femme couples, queer immigrants, and working-class women. These images were revolutionary because they were documented people who were invisible in mainstream narratives. Rather than eroticizing or stereotyping them, Aguilar photographed her subjects with dignity and warmth, presenting a community on its own terms, joyful, authentic, and unapologetically real. Her Clothed and Unclothed series placed individuals side by side, first dressed and then nude, breaking down the artifice of social presentation and revealing the human vulnerability underneath. Then there's The Three Eagles Flying in 1990. A searingly symbolic triptych. At its center, Aguilar appears bound, her head wrapped in the Mexican flag, her hips wrapped in the American flag, flanked on either side by each flag alone. UCLA professor Charlene Villaseñor Black observes that Aguilar's self-portrait challenges the idea of the female nude body as a passive object of the male gaze, transforming it into a site of cultural and political resistance. Her later works, such as nature self-portraits, merged body and landscape, positioning herself within desert terrains as though carved from the earth itself. In rejecting the traditional, idealized female nude body, Aguilar instead placed her body as a part of nature, unapologetic and undeniable. Critics often praised Aguilar for her compassion and courage, but at its heart, her work was about belonging. It's about standing at the margins and saying, "I'm here and I matter." Throughout her career, she collaborated with cultural scholars and drew inspiration from feminists like Judy Dater, yet her voice remained wholly her own. Aguilar opened doors for representation for Chicano art, feminist photography, and intersectional visual storytelling long before mainstream art institutions were ready to listen. Today, she is recognized not only as a groundbreaking photographer, but as a visionary of representation. Laura Aguilar passed away in 2018 from complications of diabetes and kidney failure. She spent her final days on Long Beach surrounded by those who understood the magnitude of her work and her spirit. Her photography continues to resonate with audiences, especially in an age consumed with curated perfection and digital filters. And so, if you've never ventured into her body of work, let this be your invitation. Some images may challenge you, some may embrace you, but all of them will compel you to think differently about who belongs in art, and who has always belonged, whether we looked or not. Horace Pippin's life was a testament to resilience. Art wrestled from hardship, history distilled through the hands of man who carried both war and marginalization in his bones. Born in 1888 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, just 23 years after the official end of slavery, Pippin grew up in a world still shadowed by its legacy. His grandparents had been enslaved, and though he was born free, that weight did shape him, as did the poverty and limited access to education. School supplies were a luxury, so Pippin improvised, sketching wherever he could and eventually entering drawing contests. At the age of 10, he won a box of crayons, a modest prize that would plant the first seeds of a lifelong passion for making pictures. His youth, however, left little room for art. By the age of 14, he left school in order to support his family, taking jobs as a hotel boy, an iron molder, and a farmhand, whatever work would keep food on the table. When the United States entered World War I, Pippin enlisted and was assigned to the 369th Infantry Regiment, a division of African American soldiers. Segregation under the U.S. military meant that his unit ultimately fought under French command, earning a reputation for valor while enduring systematic prejudice. Pippin fought in the front lines until a sniper's bullet shattered his right shoulder. He survived, but the wound left him partially disabled, his painting arm permanently weakened. Returning home, he found no hero's welcome, only limited job opportunities and lingering trauma. Yet, in this darkness, art returned to him, not as a hobby, but as a salvation. He began wood-burning images onto discarded cigar boxes, and eventually, in 1928, took up oil painting. His right arm, injured beyond steady use, required him to hold it with his left while painting, a slow, painstaking process. His first major work, End of War, Starting Home, took him 3 years to complete, but it was just as much as therapy as it was art. For years, he produced only a handful of paintings annually, but in each, his voice was unmistakable. His works chronicled the African American experience. Intimate family scenes, rural life, portraits of leaders like John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, and the searing memories of war. His anti-war paintings, including Shell Holes, Observation Balloon, and other variations of Holy Mountain, bore witness to violence with a rare stillness, as if each scene held its breath. In 1937, the art world finally noticed. The Museum of Modern Art featured Pippin's paintings in its traveling exhibition, Masters of Popular Painting in 1938, and his work drew attention to prominent collectors such as Albert C. Barnes. Yet the acclaim came with a qualifier. Critics framed his work as primitive or naive, dismissing his deliberate choices and emotional intelligence in favor of fetishizing his lack of formal training. Philosopher Cornel West would later call this a double bind for any black artist. One is either excluded from the canon because one is black, or excluded because one is black, labeled primitive. Despite his reductive lens, Pippin persevered, producing increasingly ambitious works. His most famous painting, Mr. Prejudice, in 1943, confronts racial segregation head-on, featuring allegorical figures of liberty and justice juxtaposed against symbols of war and division, a bold critique of a country fighting against fascism abroad while denying equality at home. By the final year of his life, Pippin's production skyrocketed. He painted 25 works in that year alone, a staggering leap for someone once limited to 3 or 4 annually. He died in 1946, just as he was gaining wider recognition, leaving behind a body of work both deeply personal and culturally monumental. His paintings were more than images. There are meditations on survival and dignity, rendered with a calm, almost meditative stillness, whether showing an intimate fireside scene or a battlefield's bleakness. Pippin imbued each canvas with an emotional weight that modern critics now hail as visionary. In truth, Horace Pippin painted more than with oil and brush. He painted with perseverance, with pain, with memory. His work documents the overlooked realities of African American life in the early 20th century and at the heavy price of war, insisting quietly, powerfully, that history must not forget. For centuries, a nun named Sister Pautila Nelly was little more than a footnote. Her works often attributed to men, her name barely whispered in the chronicles of Resident art? Like Resident Evil? Her name barely whispered in the chronicles of Renaissance art. Yet, behind convent walls, this nun dared what few women of her time could even imagine, painting on a monumental scale, claiming space in a world that denied her every right to create. Born Polisena Margherita Nelli, Margherita with an H, in 1524, to a wealthy Florentine family. She entered the Dominican convent of Santa Catarina at just 14, taking the name of all these fucking Italian names, bro. Taking the name of Suor Pautila. Her life was shaped by the teachings of Savonarola, whose fiery sermons urged nuns towards devotion and discipline, including the moral act of painting in a cloistered world. In this cloistered world, creativity was prayer, and Nelly's prayers took form of paint. Unlike her male contemporaries, Nelly received no formal artistic training. Convent rules forbade study of nude male form, the foundation of Renaissance figure painting. Yet she taught herself studying works by Andrea del Sarto and Bronzillo. There's no L. No, there's no L. And especially the drawings by Fra Bartolomeo, whose studies, left to the convent, became her lifeline to artistic knowledge. She signed her works humbly, yet defiantly, prey to the paintress, an acknowledgement of both her gender and her vocation. Her style diverged from her mentor's idealized restraint, adding a raw emotionality unique to her vision. In her Lamentation with Saints, for example, the female figures' red eyes, tear-streaked faces capture grief not as a stylized drama, but as lived experience. Scholar Jane Fortune calls it a case study in emotional truth. And then there was her crowning achievement, The Last Supper. Painted in the 1560s, measuring 7 meters wide, it is the first known Last Supper by a woman. Florence is famed for its many depictions of that sacred meal, from Leonardo da Vinci to Ghirlandaio. Yet, Nelly's version stands apart, not only for its scale, daring for any woman, but for the way that she saw her figures. Where other artists' apostles embody idealized masculinity, hers carries subtle traces of feminine, reflecting both her reality and her restrictions. Without access to male models, she painted the male body as she knew it, through the lens of her cloistered experience. In an era when most women artists were confined to small devotional miniatures or textiles, Nelly's monumental works were revolutionary. She painted biblical narrative, yes, but through a female gaze, centuries before feminist theory gave us the words for it. Her art is intimate yet expansive, emotional yet monumental. Despite her achievements, history largely ignored her. Her works languished in storage, many unsigned and misattributed. Only now, thanks to painstaking restorations like Lamentation with Saints at San Marco Museum, we have begun to see her brilliance again. That restoration alone required extraordinary care, even fumigating the painting for live wormwoods before cleaning and infrared analysis could begin. Nelly's rediscovery has reshaped how we view the Renaissance, not as exclusively male, but as a period where, even behind convent walls, women defied expectation and contributed to one of art history's greatest eras. Her cryptic plea, inscribed on her canvases, "Pray for the paintress," echoes as both humility and rebellion, a whispered acknowledgement to how rare and risky her vocation was. Today she's recognized as Florence's first woman painter and a pioneer whose works broke two barriers at once, proving that women could paint at the same scale and ambition as men, and offering biblical narratives seen through a uniquely female lens. Her art is not just an act of devotion, it is an act of defiance. Sister Tarsila Nelly reminds us that even within the most rigid of walls, talent and vision can flourish. And sometimes the quietest voices leave the most enduring marks. Also, I have a video linked down below that talks more in depth about her work. I highly recommend checking it out. James Hampton. No, not the actor from the original Teen Wolf in 1982. Though I do appreciate the audacity of that association, or perhaps it's too niche. I speak of another James Hampton, a janitor by day, but by night a secret architect of divinity. His masterpiece? The Throne of the Third Heaven of Nations Millennium General Assembly. Yes, that is the actual title, and yes, it is as spectacularly audacious as it sounds. Born in 1909 in Ellery, South Carolina, Hampton's life was unremarkable at first glance. Poverty, a fractured family, work as a cook, service in segregated military until World War II. He served honorably, even receiving a Bronze Star, and yet, after the war, he returned to Washington, D.C. and took a job that most would ignore, a janitor. But in the quiet, while others slept, Hampton built heaven. In 1950, he rented a small garage and over 14 years transformed it into a shimmering otherworldly vision. 180 individual objects, altars, lecterns, crowns, tablets, winged pulpits, all painstakingly crafted from scavenged materials. Aluminum foil, jelly jars, cardboard, shards of mirror, even old light bulbs, all elevated into something transcendent. The centerpiece? A 7-foot throne built from a battered old chair, crowned with the words, "Fear not." Hampton called his creation the Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nations Millennium General Assembly, drawing from the biblical prophecy, especially the Book of Revelation. It is equal parts cathedral and cosmic stage set, an apocalyptic vision filtered through the hands of one man. Its third heaven references Pauline scripture describing God's highest realm, a place unreachable by mortal means. But this was no idle obsession. Hampton recorded visions, scriptures, and what he believed to be divine instructions in a 108-page notebook, the Book of the Seven Dispensation. Most of it written in a mysterious, undeciphered script that scholars still cannot read. In its margins, Hampton crowned himself Director, Special Projects for the State of Eternity. One cannot help but marvel, a janitor working during the day, yet in his own cosmology, an appointed architect in the divine order. His work drew from both biblical imagery and African cultural traditions. Yard shows, devotional altars, and Afro-Atlantic spiritual practices like voodoo and Santeria. Actually, I think it's pronounced voodoo, but I'm not too sure, mostly because this is the correct spelling that I will be putting on screen. The voodoo that everyone talks about, the voodoo, is not the correct way and is considered derogatory towards that community. Anyways, art historian Robert Ferris Thompson called it a unique fusion of biblical and Afro-American traditional imagery. Hampton's vision wasn't simply religious. It was rooted in survival, memory, and a longing for unity in a world fractured by racism and spiritual division. And yet, despite this grandeur, Hampton remained almost entirely alone in his mission. He approached churches, hoping that his throne might serve as a tool for teaching or worship, but found little interest. He never saw his vision celebrated, never opened the storefront ministry he dreamed of, never found the holy woman he hoped would join him in his life's work. He died of stomach cancer in 1964, his creation hidden from the world. However, on a different note, when his landlord came to repossess the garage, he opened the door, and as one Smithsonian curator later put it, it was like opening Tut's tomb. The room glittered with gold and silver foil, crowns gleaming under naked bulb lights, scriptures etched into makeshift tablets. It was the kind of discovery that could only inspire one of two reactions: dismissive laughter or awe. At first, some dismissed it as the product of an eccentric janitor's delusions, as Hampton had also written texts which referred to religious visions on various pieces of paper and cardboard in each of the 7 different notebooks, as mentioned earlier. But others, artists, collectors, visionaries, recognized something profound. Sculptor Ed Kelly, stunned by the discovery, called art dealer Alice Denny, who in turn summoned heavyweights like Leo Castelli, Ivan Karp, and Robert Rauschenberg to see it. Within 6 years, the throne found a permanent home at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where it still resides, no longer hidden, no longer secret, but elevated, as Hampton himself might say, for the state of eternity. Hampton's story is one of startling duality. A man who swept floors by day and built heaven by night. He may not have considered himself an artist, but perhaps that is what made his creation so extraordinary. It is art untouched by art theory, devotion unfiltered by academic critique. In a world where creativity is often commodified, Hampton's throne remains defiantly pure, spiritual, personal, and wildly ambitious. His work forces us to confront a question. Who gets to be called an artist? Is it those trained and sanctioned by institutions? Or can it be the solitary janitor, gluing foil and old furniture in a rented garage, imagining God's kingdom? Hampton gives us the answer in silence and silver light. Greatness, indeed, can bloom in the most unexpected of places, even in the humble hands of a man who dared to build heaven. Good Lord. I still have so much to go. I still have so much to go. Tarsila do Amaral, darling of Brazilian modernism and devourer of Europe. Quite literally, at least in spirit. Imagine being a young woman born in 1886 on a coffee plantation in Capivari, Sao Paulo. A child of wealth, yes, but also of Brazil still shaking off the chains of slavery. From these roots, she rose not merely to paint, but to redefine what it meant to be Brazilian in art. As a teenager, Tarsila and her parents traveled to Spain, where she studied in Barcelona, copied classical works, and attended to the famed Académie Julian. Paris, of course, being that eternal artistic siren whispering to young painters, "Abandon your homeland's palette and drink from my cubist chalice." And many did, but not Tarsila. She went, she learned, and she absorbed like the likes of Ledger, Yote, and Gliese. And then, like any self-respecting cultural cannibal, she brought it all home and made it her own. In the beginning of 1916, Tarsila studied painting in Sao Paulo. Later, she studied drawing and painting with the academic painter Pedro Alexandrino. These were all respected but conservative teachers, because Brazil lacked a public art museum or significant cultural galleries until World War II. The Brazilian art world was aesthetically conservative and exposure to international trends was limited. And then there was the Grupos dos Cinco, where Tarsila, along with Menotti del Pacchia, Mario de Andrade, and Oswald de Andrade. I can talk about that whole group at another time if you're curious. Anyways, together they staged Semana de Arte Moderna of 1992, which, for Brazil, was what a thunderclap is for a storm. Shocking, loud, and utterly cleansing. Modernism was no longer an import. It had been naturalized, baptized, and given a Brazilian passport. But Tarsila was not content to merely paint modernist landscapes in French pastels. No, she wanted something deeply, radically Brazilian. She dug into the soil of folk religion, Baroque architecture, indigenous mythology, and the vibrant chaos of Carnival itself. And she painted with a child's palette, the bright, unapologetic colors she once adored, but had been told were unsophisticated. Imagine that, having to relearn your own love for colors. Her Abaporu, in 1928, meaning the man who eats, would go on to ignite Oswald de Andrade's Anthropophagite Manifesto. The premise? Devour European culture, digest it, and birth something entirely and utterly new. The image, an enormous-footed figure, crouched beside a cactus under a sun like a sliced citrus, became an icon for Brazil's avant-garde identity. From Abaporu came Anthropophagia in 1929, merging this new vision from her earlier lush Brazilian flora. She was no longer the little girl drawing straw dolls on the plantation. She was now painting a nation's self-image, myth and all. This was not just about art, but about national identity, rejecting colonial mimicry and asserting cultural independence. Her style danced between cubism's fractured forms and surrealist dream logic, but always rooted in Brazilian soil. Whether depicting Sao Paulo's industrial rise or the raw textures of rural life. And yet, let us not overlook her other creative ventures. Yes, she did even compose music, a lovely song in an A minor called Rondo de Amor, hidden in family archives until its rediscovery in 2021, which I will link down in the comments below. Tarsila, it seems, has always been polyphonic. Also, please listen to it. It is very good. I listened to it for an hour while I was doing this. It is so fucking good. Excuse my French. Of course, life was not all manifestos and surreal lemons. Her marriage to Oswald de Andrade collapsed in 1930, and with it, the romantic half of her artistic revolution. She traveled to the Soviet Union, got herself imprisoned back in Brazil for suspected communist sympathies, and shifted her focus towards social themes, painting the working class, the marginalized, the Brazil beyond coffee plantations and cosmopolitan salons. Her later work became a testament to resilience rooted in Europe's shadow, but in Brazil's own identity. Critics called her the most Brazilian of painters, which is an elegant way of saying that she captured the sun, birds, and the feverish modernity of her homeland in a way that no Parisian could replicate. She would live long enough to see the retrospectives and critical acclaim to become an icon to generations of Latin American artists carving their own path. Today, she's immortalized on not only gallery walls, not only in MoMA retrospectives, but also on Mercury itself. Yes, there is a crater named Amaral, a celestial wink for a woman who painted suns like no one else. Tarsila devoured Europe, yes, but more importantly, she fed Brazil back into itself. Stripped of colonial mimicry and clothed instead of its own audacious colors, shapes, and myths. And that, my darling specters and lovely mortals, is not merely modernism, that is cultural alchemy. Okay, future me here. While editing, I also found a website that has many, if not most, of Tarsila's work in a digital archive, which I will also be linking down below if you would like to go and admire or study her art further than what I've shown here today. That's all. Okay, back to the video. Cloud Cahoon. Now there was a creature who refused to be taxonomized, filed, or gendered neatly into a library drawer. Born Lucy Schwab in 1894, but let's not get too comfortable with that name. By 1914, they had rechristened themselves as Cloud Cahun, a moniker with no allegiance to he or she, a name as elegant and as evasive as the person who wrote it. One could say Cahun bent gender, like light through a prism, but that's too soft. No, they shattered it, gleefully, with lipstick, monocles, shoulder pads, and the most exquisitely shaved head this side of a marble bust. Cahun once wrote, "Masculine? Feminine? It really depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me." Now, let us not pretend their work was simply art. It was a declaration, a duel, a dare. Cloud used mirrors, masks, shadows, and scissors to carve through social expectations. The result? Self-portraits that feel more like spells than selfies. Glimpses of a body in flux, not to mystify but to reclaim, from a world too afraid of anything that doesn't politely sit on a binary shelf. With lifelong partner Susan Malherbe, known artistically as Marcel Moore, Cahun built a dazzling and dangerous little world. Picture it, two queer artists, stepsisters by technicality, but lovers by soul, collaborators by design. Their photos weren't just portraits, they were costume dramas of identity, camp epics of resistance. They cross-dressed not for the gaze, but to unmake it. A dandy here, a vampire there, a Japanese puppet in one shot, a mournful angel in the next. Imagine living your truth before the world even had the vocabulary to affirm it. And while surrealism puffed its mustached chest in Paris, mostly parading women as passive muses or erotic riddles, Cloud Cahun walked in, shaved their head, stared down the camera, and wrote in terms. They're not your metaphor. They're your mirror. Of course, this was more than performance art. It was warfare. Literally. When Nazis occupied the Channel Island of Jersey, Cahun and Moore stayed behind, not to survive, but to resist. Armed with poetry, satire, and scissors, they infiltrated German events, slipping anti-Nazi pamphlets into pockets and cigarette boxes like two queer ghosts haunting fascism's dinner party. Their code name? Der Soldat ohne Namen, the soldier without a name. Eventually, they were arrested, sentenced to death, and, miraculously, spared. Cahun told the Nazi judge, "I'm a Jew and a resister." That line, that was the shot. And they pulled the trick themselves. They died in 1954, having lived far too fiercely for a world to notice at the time. Cloud made work for themselves. Not for galleries, not for glory, but for truth. But history, ever the slow learner, finally caught up. Now Cahun's work is studied, exalted, and beloved by those of us who never saw ourselves in history books, but found them in mirrors made by revolutions. Today we call it genderqueer, non-binary, transmass, transfemme, fluid, proto-trans, terms that Claude didn't have, but somehow already embodied. Their influence is seen in contemporary artists such as Cindy Sherman, and their life story serves as a reminder that art can challenge not just aesthetics, but entire social constructs. And let us not forget, they were not ahead of their time was simply behind. And so, for every trans body politicized, erased, or debated in a courtroom by cowards with gavel fetishes and blissful ignorance, Cloud Cahun is there, middle finger poised, monocle in place, face painted with quiet defiance of someone who's already outlived their executioners. On another note, an opera about the lives of Cahun and more have been commissioned by the West Edge Opera with a planned 2027 premiere. I just thought it was worth mentioning for those curious about them. Let us talk about our last artist, Richard Bruce Nugent. With the Harlem Renaissance glittering, unapologetically queer comet blazing across the sky, already electric with jazz and defiance. Born in 1906, Washington, D.C., Nugent had the sort of charm that could talk its way past any door, and sometimes any category. He was openly gay in an era when openly gay was often followed by arrested or exiled. But Nugent didn't come out so much as he refused to step in. By the time the Harlem Renaissance had roared to life, Nugent packed his bags and his pseudonyms and headed to New York. Harlem at the time was a black cultural renaissance, a space where brilliance lived in every brownstone and piano bar. But even in that storm of creation, Nugent stood out. Not just because he was openly queer, but because he wrote about it. Blatantly, beautifully, and brazenly. But even in that storm of creation, Nugent stood out. Not just because he was openly queer, but because he wrote about it. Blatantly, beautifully, and brazenly. Before committing his life to his art, Nugent worked several ordinary jobs, including that as a hat seller, a delivery boy, and a bellhop. During his time as a bellhop, he fell in love with a hotel kitchen employee. Nugent's Smoke, Lilies, and Jade was a short story as languid and lush as the title, written in a modernist haze. It followed a story of a young man named Alex and his love for beauty, a man who may or may not have been based on Nugent's own lover from his bellhop days. The story celebrated same-sex desire without apology or coded shame, and critics hated it. Alan Locke, father of the New Negro movement, was practically clutching pearls, calling it effeminate and decadent. He wasn't just a writer, though. He was a painter, a dancer, a drag performer, and one of those people who seemed allergic to boredom, much like myself. He lived with fellow writer Wallace Thurman in what was affectionately nicknamed, I'm not saying that name. It was a place where black artists, writers, and dreamers threw parties, and probably made prohibition agents weep. Nugent danced with ballet companies, toured in porgy, and occasionally donned dress for the New Negro Art Theater dance troupe, long before gender performance had its current vocabulary. And yet, Nugent wasn't some disembodied spirit floating through artistic salons. He was human. He married Grace Marr in 1952, a marriage full of affection, but ultimately haunted by the impossible weight of changing someone's sexuality. Through it all, Nugent remained exactly himself, a queer black man, creating beauty and chaos wherever he landed. When he wasn't sketching or writing about desire, he was shaping Harlem's culture future, co-founding Harlem Cultural Council, advocating for art funding, even helping lay out groundwork for the Schomburg Center, that cathedral of black history and culture. Nugent lived until 1987, quietly passing away from heart failure, but leaving behind his work as anything but quiet. His art, both written and visual, refused to straighten itself out for anyone's comfort, essaying sensual truths in an era where even whispering them could cost you everything. Today, when queer black artists carve out space to tell their own stories, Nugent's ghost is likely perched in the corner, cigarette in hand, paintbrush behind one ear, smirking at anyone who still thinks authenticity is negotiable. He reminds us that your truth might scandalize others, so let it. After all, scandal has always been the opening act of progress. And so, what do these artists have in common? They are all brilliant, daring, and yet systematically pushed to their margins, whether for race, gender, sexuality, nationality, or disability. And yet they remain known to art history and museums, though some never lived to see it. But art history has a funny way of resurrecting its ghosts. What unites these artists, my dear specters, is not just their creativity, but their refusal to bend to a world that wanted them silent. From a cloistered nun daring to paint, to queer voices exploring identity, to a janitor crafting a heavenly throne, to a disabled veteran refusing to abandon his creative therapy, and a metaphorical cannibal, these figures remind us that art is resistance. By resurrecting their stories, we don't just honor their work, we challenge the structures that buried them in the first place, challenge the gatekeepers of history, and open the door for new voices yet to come. Leave a comment if you'd like me to unearth another forgotten soul, or embark on your own seance. After all, history is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone curious enough to call its name. Until next time, dear specters and immortals alike, stay curious, stay kind, and keep looking beyond the frame. Also, I hope you enjoyed watching 10 hours of my work on this art piece become an easy 30 minutes, haha! Featuring allegorical figures of liberty and justice juxtaposed be so fucking for real. Juxtaposed. What? Allegorical figures of liberty and justice juxtapose. I did it again. What the fuck? Justice juxtapose. Bro, this is like my 5th or 6th take. I can't say the word. Juxtapose. Okay. Juxtapose. What the fuck? What the fuck?